Since the creation of the first atomic weapon, the threat of global destruction and catastrophe has always been a topic of discussion. But how close has the world really come to an all-out nuclear war? In today's video, we will discuss what could have possibly been the closest two superpowers have ever come to nuclear conflict. Before diving into the event of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is important to understand the state of relations with the former Soviet Union and the United States. With the Cold War surging on, the two superpowers were racing to build up arms, influence, and reach outer space. Meanwhile, in Cuba, a young nationalist by the name of Fidel Castro had come to power by overthrowing Cuba's American-backed government in 1959. While many Cubans welcomed the change in power, American officials were becoming increasingly nervous about the new regime. Though Batista's government had proven to be corrupt and repressive, it was still seen as pro-American, as it was allied with US companies operating in Cuba and reliably anti-communist. By contrast, Castro's disapproval of operations by American companies brought forth the nationalization of American-dominated industries. These new ties between Cuba and the Soviet Union will cause tensions between the US and the island, with the US prohibiting importation of Cuban products. Castro's influence on other Latin American governments began increasing, and the US started considering Castro's regime to be a threat to American interests. So much so that President Dwight D. Eisenhower secretly authorized the CIA to recruit thousands of Cuban exiles living in Miami and to begin training to overthrow Castro's government. By January 1961, the US government, with now new President John F. Kennedy, had completely cut its diplomatic relations with Cuba and prepared for an invasion of the island. On April 17, 1961, the Cuban Exile Brigade began their invasion of Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a massive disaster that it could very well be worthy of its own video. The operation was a complete failure, with the CIA-trained exiles surrendering after less than a day of fighting. According to many historians, the CIA and the Cuban Exile Brigade believed that President Kennedy will eventually allow the American military to intervene in Cuba. However, President Kennedy was hesitant in authorizing attacks that might lead to an all-out war with the Soviet-backed island. This state of affairs will later be brought to its peak with the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro was determined to deter any future invasions by the US. So much so that by July of 1962, Castro had come to a secret agreement with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to place Soviet nuclear missiles on the island, with construction of multiple missile sites beginning late that summer. US intelligence would later discover evidence of Soviet arms being stockpiled in Cuba, and President Kennedy issued a public warning against the introduction of offensive weapons on the island. Despite the warning, the US would discover sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles in Cuba in late October. Many of Kennedy's advisors, including all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for an airstrike to destroy the missiles, followed by an invasion of the island. President Kennedy decided on a more peaceful approach. On October 22nd, President Kennedy ordered the US Navy to establish a naval blockade on the island. This prevented the Soviets from delivering additional missiles and military equipment to Cuba. He also sent a letter to Khrushchev in which he demanded the Soviet Union to dismantle missile sites that were completed or still under construction and to return all offensive weapons back to the Soviet Union, or the US would have to use military force in order to protect its national security. This will be the first of many letters and communications between the Kremlin and the White House. The president also went on national television to inform the American public about the situation in Cuba and his decision to impose a blockade. He also mentioned the potential global consequences if the crisis continued to escalate. A military readiness status of DEFCON 3 was announced, which increased readiness over normal circumstances, and US forces accelerated plans for a military strike. Following President Kennedy's public declaration, many around the world nervously waited for a Soviet response, with some Americans hoarding food and supplies, freeing the country at the brink of a nuclear war. The Soviets responded to President Kennedy's message with a statement that the US blockade was a, quote, act of aggression, and that the Soviet ships bound to the island will be ordered to proceed. On October 24th and 25th, Soviet ships reached the American blockade. Some turned back from the quarantine line, while others were stopped by US Navy but were allowed later to continue after being searched for offensive weapons. US spy planes would indicate that some missile sites were nearing operational readiness. The US would place its forces under DEFCON 2, meaning that war involving Strategic Air Command was imminent, and on October 26, Kennedy would tell his advisors that it appeared that only a US attack on Cuba would remove the missiles. Despite the enormous tension, Kennedy was still hopeful for a diplomatic resolution, and he got it. That same evening, reports of a Soviet message came to light. Khrushchev's message offered to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange of a promise from US leaders to not invade the island. Though the message seemed legitimate, the sense of relief was short-lived. The next day, Khrushchev would send another message that the deal must include the US removing its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That same day, a US spy plane would be shot down over Cuba, killing Major Rudolph Anderson, who is considered the only US combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy would respond to Khrushchev's first message and propose steps in removing Soviet missiles from Cuba under supervision of the United Nations. He also guaranteed that the US would not attack Cuba. However, Kennedy's proposal did not mention the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Under a secret meeting with the Soviet ambassador, the US Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, indicated that the US was planning to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but this could not be part of any public resolution. The next morning, on October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba, bringing an end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although the crisis was over, the US naval blockade continued until November 20th, 1962, when the Soviets agreed to remove its bombers from Cuba. As for the US, it would remove its missiles from Turkey until April of 1963. As a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a direct telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin was established, and it became known as the Hotline. Both countries will later begin to reconsider the nuclear arms race and began working on a nuclear test ban treaty. Though there was some sobering moments in regards to nuclear weapons, the Cold War was all but over. In fact, another outcome of the crisis is that it convinced the Soviets to increase investments in ballistic missiles that could reach the US from the Soviet territory. With the state of affairs going on in the world, it is important to look back at the time where diplomacy was a true victor in the catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis shows us that armed conflict should be the last thing on the leader's mind and that different avenues should be explored instead of holding the whole world hostage with a risk of a nuclear war. What are some steps do you think humanity can take to prevent events like these? Let me know what you think in the comments below.